So I posted a tantalizing GIF teaser of what I was going to be talking about today. I bet the obvious guess of what it was Celtic art. But that would be wrong. I'm going to talk about that in a later week. What we're going to do today is play a riveting round of That's Not Celtic, which is a fun game I came up with because even in the world where archaeologists have some very extreme, broad definitions of the things they call Celts or they call Celtic, there is stuff that in the public gets called Celtic that really has no proper right being called it. It's different reasons for it, and there's going to be a lot of caveats coming with what I'm going to say, but the idea here is to kind of know what you're talking about and to think about the things that we call Celtic for some strange reason. The first one might be lesser known, but you'll know what I'm getting at if you've seen Braveheart, because it's blue face paint. And if you've watched Braveheart, you'll have noticed that William Wallace seems to spend a lot of time running around with more blue on the face than an 80s prom queen. Now, do any archaeologists or historians of late medieval Scotland think that warriors went around with a whole bunch of blue on the face? No, not really. So where does that idea come from? It's actually from Roman accounts of Britain when they were invading the island. When they got to the northern part that they never really conquered, what's now Scotland, there were these people living there that are usually called the Picts. And the Picts apparently did paint their bodies with this blue stuff called woad. The thing about that is that the Picts were there when the Romans invaded. The William Wallace time period is about 1,000 years later, a full millennium later. From what we can actually tell, the practice had kind of stopped by then. So why would someone decide that William Wallace was painted blue? It actually has an interesting story, and it has to do with the era of colonialism when European peoples were encountering indigenous peoples from other parts of the world. They kind of came up with this whole idea of what savages were, and they came up with the idea that savages were sort of stuck in the past. They saw things like tattooing in parts of the world like North America. They decided that ancient Britons from the past must have been covered in tattoos and blue paint. And then someone came along with that idea of what ancient Britain looked like and decided Mel Gibson would look great covered in woad. So now it's this whole prehistoric Britain popular culture idea that woad was the British way. This is to the point that it actually winds up some places it really, really shouldn't be. Not just Braveheart, Hollywood, Scotland. Natural History Museum in London, ancient Scotland. This is an exhibit book from the Britain 1 Million Years the Human Story exhibit that was at the Natural History Museum when I was there in the summer. This guy is supposed to be a Neanderthal. This might be kind of hard to see because, of course, the picture of the caveman is really drab, but he's got these blue chevrons painted across his chest. The hilarious thing about that is that the Neanderthals were in Britain before the Ice Age. The Ice Age came along, Britain turned into a glacial desert, no one lived there. The Picts came after that. The idea that there was somehow cultural continuity between the Neanderthals and the Picts is pretty much ridiculous. I'm not saying that the Neanderthals couldn't have painted themselves with woad, but the reason that someone thought or came up with the idea is more to do with Mel Gibson than it is to do with archaeology. Now, the thing about this is also that the Picts are generally thought of as a Celtic people. So I guess in a way this blue face paint stuff is sort of a Celtic thing, and the misattribution of it is more to do with prehistoric Britain and Celts in general, but the idea here is that you need to be critical of where you're applying this stuff and knowing where the idea comes from. The second one is also sort of Mel Gibson's fault because this one shows up wrong in Braveheart too. It's tartan. Now, tartan and plaid garments do come from Celtic areas like Scotland, Ireland, but fairly recently, like the last 500 years. The thing is, though, that people think of it as so quintessentially Celtic. If you show them like a scrap of sort of checked fabric from a Hallstatt mine or that weird tomb in China that people went crazy about and decided was Celtic, they go, aha, it must be tartan, and it then becomes proof that these people were Celtic. Similarly, if you just describe like a striped garment, people sort of decide that it must be tartan if you're talking about anything vaguely Celtic. The thing is, though, that like I said, tartans and plaid garments like belted plaids and kilts are really fairly recent. They didn't exist before like the Renaissance era. Another thing about them is that that whole idea we have about certain tartans being associated with certain clans is kind of a even later romantic revision on the past. That didn't exist. So when you see someone like Queen Boudica being drawn in head-to-toe tartan plaids, it's kind of questionable. This one might also sort of be a disappointment, but it's Stonehenge and other megalithic monuments from Western Europe. See, they were built in the Neolithic, which is the new Stone Age. Admittedly, this is fairly late, probably quite late in the Stone Age, but if you remember, Celts are usually associated, if they are called Celts, with the Iron Age. There's a whole intervening Bronze Age between when these things were built and when anyone that gets called Celtic shows up. The idea why a lot of people thought at one point that the stuff like Stonehenge or Brú na Bóinne in Ireland or Maes Howe in Scotland were Celtic things has to do with the cultural historical archaeologists that I've mentioned before. There was this kind of idea that the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East was basically the cradle of civilization, and that if anything good showed up anywhere else, it had to have come from there. It was called the Ex Oriente Lux hypothesis. So the idea was that the Western European stone monuments must have been these dim imitations of these monuments in Minoan Crete, so by consequence, the Western European ones must have been younger than the Cretan ones. So, people thought that it was around the right time for the Celts. In fact, though, recent archaeologists have come along and said actually these things are really, really freaking old, like thousands of years older than people used to think, so they're not actually anything to do with the Celts. Now, the interesting thing here is that when people that we usually think of as Celtic were living in Britain and Ireland or France or Spain or wherever these things are found, the monuments were still visible and people interacted with them. Places like Brú na Bóinne, we actually see burials being continued to be made at these places until really late into the medieval period, and they show up in medieval Irish stories as fairy mounds. So people were still continuing to interact with them, but the idea that that's when they were made is completely wrong. The whole idea of Stonehenge being like a druid temple, no, I don't think so. Now you might be thinking, where does that GIF I posted come in with a little bit of dread? And that's because I saved the best for last. Knotwork. That's about the extent of my knotwork drawing abilities. Now this might seem a little bit insane. For a lot of people, knotwork is the most basically Celtic thing they can probably think of. It's to the point that most of the time we don't even just say knotwork on its own. It's Celtic knotwork. And to be fair, there are a lot of really famous artifacts, especially from Ireland, like the Tara brooch, that have knotwork on them. There's a whole series of howevers that goes with this, though. For one, knotwork is not the sole, and really not even the main, form of Celtic artwork. There's another kind called Latin art that I'll talk about later. For two, knotwork is not solely associated with the Celts. It's found among the Anglo-Saxons. It was in medieval Scandinavian art, so the Vikings had it. It's even in medieval Russia. It's really more of a Northern European thing. It also didn't originate with the Celts. So there is knotwork that's Celtic. Knotwork itself is not really Celtic. That's my stance on these things anyway. I know there are going to be people who disagree with me or who just continue talking about this stuff in the same ways despite what I've said. My moral to the story, though, is know what you're talking about. Don't throw the word Celt around too much like I've been saying all along. Don't think Vikings are somehow Celtic because they have knotwork. And I'll see you next week.